Okay, if you grew up on movies or games, you've definitely heard this name. Arthur, King Arthur, the guy with the sword and the stone, the round table, Merlin, Guinevere, Camelot. Welcome to the channel. Let's dig in. First, let's be completely honest with each other. There is no document signed Arthur, King of Britain. None. Zero. Doesn't exist. Sorry. And this is a big, but there are some incredibly interesting mentions scattered across ancient texts. And once you start connecting the dots, things get real interesting, real fast. Nennius, Historia Brittonum, approximately 820 AD. The first serious mention of Arthur comes from a Welsh monk named Nennius. He writes about a, quote, dux vallorum, not a king, a war leader, a military commander, and he lists 12 battles this Arthur supposedly won against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. The most important one? The Battle of Baden Hill, somewhere around 490 to 520 AD, Britons versus Saxons, and the Britons won. Here's the thing, that battle is real. Multiple independent sources confirm it happened. Was Arthur there? Nennius says yes, but Nennius was writing 300 years after the fact. That's like me today writing history from the 1720s with no archives. How much do you trust that? Annales Cambriae, approximately 960 AD. Then there's the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals. Arthur shows up twice. First entry, the Battle of Baden, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victors. Second entry, the Battle of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medrawt fell. Camelot, the final battle. Sounds familiar, right? But again, written centuries after the events. Gildas, the only contemporary source. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. There is one writer who lived through this period, a monk called Gildas the Wise, writing around 540 AD. He describes the Battle of Baden in detail. He talks about the chaos, the Saxon invasions, the British resistance. But Arthur, he never mentions him, not once. That either means Arthur wasn't there, or Gildas had a personal reason to leave him out. Some researchers actually think there was bad blood between them. Medieval drama, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, documents are great, but honestly, I love when there's something you can actually touch. So what does archaeology give us? Tintagel, the place many people call Arthur's Castle. Tintagel, in Cornwall. Legend says this is where Arthur was born. And here's what's real. Excavations uncovered a powerful, fortified settlement. Dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries, trade goods from the Mediterranean, imported pottery. Clear signs that a wealthy elite lived here. This wasn't some forgotten village. This place mattered. Then, in 1998, they found something strange. A stone. Today it's known as the Artognu stone. The inscription roughly translates to Artognu, descendant of Coll, made this Artognu. Not Arthur, but close. Very close, and researchers still argue about it today. Maybe it was a completely different person with a similar name, or maybe it's part of a trail historians have been searching for all along. Now let's move to another site, Cadbury Castle, what some people call the real Camelot. Back in the 1960s, archaeologist Leslie Alcock led major excavations at South Cadbury in Somerset. And here's the interesting part. Local people had been calling this place Camelot for centuries. So what did they find? Massive fortifications, a great hall, huge wooden ramparts, and all of it dated to the 5th and 6th centuries, exactly the time Arthur was supposed to have lived. Now, there's no direct proof this was Arthur's castle, but somebody powerful ruled from here, somebody important enough to control a major stronghold during one of Britain's darkest periods. And finally, Glastonbury, the so-called Tomb of Arthur. In 1191, monks at Glastonbury Abbey announced they had discovered the burial site of Arthur and Guinevere, complete with an inscription that supposedly read, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur." Sounds incredible. There's just one problem. Most historians today think it was probably a medieval publicity stunt. The abbey had recently burned down. They desperately needed money. And what attracts pilgrims better than the grave of Britain's greatest legendary king? Tourists, pilgrims, donations. Some things never change. But honestly, that almost makes the story even more entertaining. All right, let's play detective. If Arthur were a real person, who exactly was he? Candidate number 1, Ambrosius Aurelianus Gildas. The one writer who was actually there mentions a real British warlord named Ambrosius Aurelianus, Romano-British nobleman. Fought the Saxons successfully in the 5th century. Some historians believe Arthur is either Ambrosius himself or a commander who served under him and got all the glory over time. Candidate number 2, Lucius Artorius Castus. Here's a wild one. There was a real Roman officer named Lucius Artorius Castus, 2nd or 3rd century AD. He commanded Sarmatian cavalry in Britain. Sarmatian cavalry, heavy armored horsemen. Sound familiar? Some researchers see a direct link. Those warriors could be the original inspiration for the Knights of the Round Table. Artorius even led a military campaign to Armorica, modern-day Brittany, the same region tied to Arthurian legend in later texts. Candidate number 3, a composite figure. Or, and this is my personal favorite theory, Arthur isn't one person at all. Maybe over hundreds of years, several different British warlords got merged into one legendary hero. It happens all the time in history. Robin Hood, Roland in French legend. Real seeds, legendary fruit. Even if a real Arthur existed, how did he become this Arthur? The one with the sword in the stone, the round table, the wizard? That's a separate, equally fascinating story. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the game changer. In 1138, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth publishes The History of the Kings of Britain. And this is where everything explodes. Suddenly, Arthur isn't just a warlord, he's a king, he has Merlin, he has Camelot, he conquers half of Europe. He pulls a sword from a stone. Geoffrey was writing for the Norman aristocracy, the new rulers of England who needed a grand British mythology. He gave them one. Part history, part fiction, part Celtic mythology, blended into one perfect story. Chrétien de Troyes, adding Lancelot. Then the French poet Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century adds Lancelot. The love triangle with Guinevere, the Holy Grail, all completely invented. Before Chrétien, there was no Lancelot. Zero, he made him up. Then Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in 1485. And that's essentially the version that made it to Hollywood. So the Arthur, he's the result of 1,000 years of additions. Every era rewrote him for their own audience. Every writer added their own layer. Kind of like how every decade gets its own version of Batman. Same hero, completely different story. So, did Arthur exist? Here's the honest answer from someone who's spent time in the actual sources. Almost certainly. Yes, some version of him. A British war leader or a warlord of the 5th or 6th century, someone who fought against the Saxon invasion, someone who may have actually been at the Battle of Badon, one of the most decisive battles of post-Roman Britain. A real person whose name survived the Dark Ages when almost nothing else did. But the Arthur with Excalibur, Camelot, the Round Table, Merlin at his side, that's a myth. A beautiful, powerful, living myth that humanity has been building for 1,500 years. And here's what I actually find more interesting than whether he was real. Why do we need him to be real? Every culture creates its hero, the perfect leader, the righteous warrior, the king who will return when the land needs him most. Arthur is Britain's answer to that need. And maybe, in some way that matters more than archaeology, that makes him more real than any historical document ever could. That's it for today, guys. If you enjoyed this, drop a like. Seriously, it takes 1 second and it helps this channel grow more than you know. Tell me in the comments, do you think Arthur was real? I genuinely want to know what you think. Subscribe if you want more of this. Next video. What medieval knighthood actually looked like in real life. Not the movies, not the games, the real thing. Spoiler, it was messy, brutal, and way more interesting than you expect. See you next week. Stay sharp.